Great. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today as we talk about rollback strategies. As John said, my name is Bob Walker. I'm a field CTO at Octopus Deploy. And today we're going to be talking about something that's very near and dear to my heart, which is rollbacks. But before we get started on that, just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. You're going to get a recording of this webinar within 24 hours of this finishing up. In addition, we'll also ask you to submit a survey, give any sort of feedback. I value any sort of feedback I get. It helps me out. Hopefully, you find this session useful. If this is your first experience with Octopus Deploy, if you're curious about how Octopus Deploy works, head over to our website, octopus.com, and you can start a free trial. And while you're there, go ahead and join our community Slack. We have over 5,000 members, and it ranges from DevOps people to developers to operations to uh, platform engineers to anything else in between. So, just a little bit about me before we get started, because hopefully it will understand where I'm kind of coming from. So, as you can see on the screen, I started at Octopus Deploy in 2018 as one of the first US based employees. But before I was an Octopus Deploy employee, I was an Octopus Deploy customer for many years. And in fact, I was a very big fan of Octopus Deploy because it solved a number of issues. And prior to that, I worked as a developer for over 15 years up until that point. And I have been exposed to any number of different rollback strategies from the good, the bad, the ugly to the aspirational. And what I want today to be is kind of a culmination of all of that experience to distill it down into a 1 hour webinar or less so you can understand how rollbacks should work. Now, I do apologize up front. This webinar will be less focused on Octopus Deploy itself. I do have plenty of demonstrations using Octopus Deploy, but it is going to be more slide heavy as we kind of work through some of the theories of rollbacks because there's going to be diagrams, there's going to be some explanation, and hopefully you'll kind of get a good understanding of where I'm coming from with the various different rollback strategies. So that being said, we're going to have three different rollback strategies. We'll have a 10-minute, a 3-minute, and immediate rollback. We'll also have go over the rollback definition. We'll talk a little bit about that pesky database. And then we're going to move on to the automated rollbacks. So let's start off with a rollback definition. And this is mostly so everyone can get on the same page. So when I refer to a rollback, what I'm referring to is we want to revert to a previous version of our application. And that could be for any number of reasons. It could be for we have bad code that just went out there and it's just not starting up, to we have a show stopping bug, to anything else in between. Whatever the case may be, we need to get back to the previous version. So in my screenshot, I have we want to go back from 1.4 back to 1.3 because we know it was working. Now, in terms of Octopus Deploy, the capability to redeploy a previous version of an application has been within the product for, oh my gosh, I don't know, uh, at least 7 years, if not more, since I started using it. And to do that, you just find the version that you want to redeploy. In this particular case, I've highlighted 2021.9.9.3. We click on that, and then we open up the deployment overview screen. We select the overflow menu, and then we select redeploy. And it will redeploy the application, redeploy that version for us. But that's a bit of a sledgehammer, to be completely honest, if we just did something like that. Specifically, you'll see in step 2 of my screenshot, we're going to be talking a little bit about the database. And so if we were to do something like this, it would rerun the step to deploy the database. And that's where we get into that pesky database. And this is where things kind of come off the rails when we start talking about rollbacks. Because when you think about it, your database is the critical piece of your application. A significant amount of effort, time, resources is spent keeping the database up and running. If anything were to happen to that database, a page is going to go out. Your DBAs are going to be notified right away. We have special people dedicated to keeping that database up and running. Those are your DBAs. And so one of the terms that we like to use internally at Octopus Deploy is here be dragons. And so when we want to solve a big goal, The question is where is the big monster for us to slay? And the database is going to be one of the biggest monsters of them all. And so the question becomes, how do you roll back a database? And this is where kind of the coding horror comes into play. So you have three general options. You can restore a previous database version, and oftentimes I'll hear, oh, that's totally what we're going to do for our rollback. But there's a small problem with doing that. And that is you're going to have some sort of data loss because you are going backwards in time and restoring a database from a previous state. It could be 15 minutes ago worth of data loss, or it could be several hours worth of data loss. And depending on the application, that may or may not be acceptable. You also will have an impact on any dependent systems. So internally at Octopus Deploy, we have a account ID that we use that's tied to a number of different things internally. So that's how we tie uh, different users to an account, different users to a license key, to different companies. And so if we had an account ID that no longer existed, that would cause quite a significant number of problems in our dependent systems that are downstream from that. There's also the concern of what do users have to re-enter? And so there's going to be some sort of data that someone will have to re-enter. So that is a bit of a concern. So if you don't want to roll back your database or restore your to a previous database version, then the question will become, can I just run some rollback scripts? Now, the thing to remember is that rollbacks are typically the exception. You're not doing that with every single deployment. And so much so, what I found is that because they are the exceptions, there's a minimal amount of effort that's put into your rollbacks. And the scripts themselves are fairly simplistic. So, example, imagine we added a column onto a table. Well, the rollback script could just drop that column off of the table. But there's no real consideration as to what will happen if we drop that column off the table. Is there going to be a lot of data that we're going to lose? The people are going to have to re enter. What's the user experience going to be like? But again, because this doesn't happen very often, not a lot of effort or not a lot of thought is put into something like that. And typically, I found is that they're not tested unless you are testing your rollback scripts. You have no idea if they're going to work. Oftentimes, it's just a checkbox. Yep, we successfully have all of our rollback scripts. Finally, the option is to leave the database as is. And this does have some appeal to it, but what you're going to be doing is running the previous app version using the current database schema. So, has that been tested? And depending on your situation, it probably hasn't been tested. And so there's that concern as well. Now, if you're a fan of action 90s films like I am, one of my favorite films is Speed. And if you haven't seen Speed, that's fine. Um, in the movie, there's two characters, Keanu Reeves' character and Jeff Bridges' character, and they're having a conversation about kind of a no-win scenario where someone takes the hostage. And so Keanu Reeves' character goes, "Hey, just shoot the hostage, take them out of the equation." Now, I'm not saying that we need to shoot the database or get rid of the database or anything insane like that, because that doesn't help anybody. But what I'm saying is we want to take the database out of the equation when it comes to rollbacks. And what I mean by that is don't ever roll back the database. The database is always going forward no matter what. Meanwhile, the application itself, that can go forward and then go back and then go forward and go back and go forward. So that's the only thing that we'll consider when we want to discuss rollbacks. But having this thought process does have some implications. And so we'll get into what that means for the rollbacks, but I'm not saying we should never restore database backups either, but use them as a option of last resort. For example, disaster recovery, the SAN goes down, or a critical Azure data center goes down because of cooling issues or something along those lines. So you want to restore those database backups kind of as the last resort, not the first option. So let's get into the different strategies that are available to us when we want to start talking about rollbacks, with the consideration that we're not going to be rolling back the database. Now, within Octopus Deploy, we have that concept of projects. And projects is where we store our deployment process. And if you have tightly coupled components, which is typically what typically happens when you have code in a database, then you should deploy everything together. So the reason why I would say code and database are typically tightly coupled together is imagine if we wanted to rename a column. Well, we would run sp rename, update the views, update the stored procedures, and then we would update the code and we push all of that out all at the exact same time. So that means they're tightly coupled together because I make a change to the database, I have to make a change to the code right away. If I don't roll out both of them at the same time, then everything is going to cause all kinds of problems. Now, in this scenario, if we take the database out of the equation, what we would do is we would skip the steps that deploy the database during a rollback. So in this particular example, I'm skipping step 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 when I want to do my rollback. Now, how this works is you really can only do this if you have zero or very minor schema changes. And what I mean by minor schema changes, imagine we added an existing column to a view, or we added an existing column onto a retrieval store procedure. And if we encounter some sort of blocking or show-stopping bug after we do a deployment, so imagine we deployed to test and we have a critical bug there, and now we've blocked QA or business owners or business analysts from testing anything, be in they cannot test other functionality because of this show-stopping bug. So we could roll it back to a previous version. And during that deployment, all of the database steps are skipped. Now, the reason why I call this a 10-minute recovery or a 10-minute rollback is because a decision must be made to determine if it is safe to roll back. And that takes a bit of time. And so it could take anywhere from 5 to 10 to 15 minutes to do that. So let's look at what this looks like within Octopus Deploy. And so I have my various different recovery models. Let's go into the 10-minute recovery. And I have a deployment ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy to production. I'll go ahead and kick this off right away. Now, what we're going to see is this very first step called calculate deployment mode. And this is really the linchpin to this whole process. And this is a step template that I wrote. You can get this on our community library right away. And you can install this and put this as your very first step in your own deployment process. Now, what it's doing is it's detecting that we're doing a deployment. And so we're setting an output variable to deploy. Now, if you're not familiar with output variables, don't worry, you're going to learn all about them fairly quickly, in fact. So output variables allow us to have variables set in one step, in this particular case, calculate deployment mode, and then we can use those variables in subsequent steps. So we'll be using those variables in step 2, 3, 4, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, one thing with variables, specifically if we want to use variable output variables in run conditions, is that variable run conditions are always evaluated, even if there's an error. And so this step also provides you with the way to use it if we only want to run certain steps if something is successful. And so in our particular case, we're going to be using this value. Unless there's an error, meaning don't run this if an error occurs, then check to see if we're doing a deployment. And so if we come into our deployment process itself and we take a look at step 2, what we'll see is our variable run condition has been set. Unless there's an error, then only run this if we're doing a deployment. If we're not doing a deployment, then we don't want to run this step at all. And we'll see that same step run, that same variable condition for step 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So how this would look in terms of rolling back is let's go ahead and take a look at that. First, we just have to wait for this deployment to finish up. I always tempt the demo gods in terms of how fast something's going to run and how fast I'm going to say something. So this should finish up in just a few seconds. But let's say after this deployment is complete, we have some sort of error. We find some sort of error. Well, we can come in here and we could download this report and we could take a look at what has changed. We could see that we had nothing change. So this means that we can roll back with no consequences. There's no concern with doing a rollback now because there have been no changes. So let's go into the previous version and we would then select this and we'd want to redeploy it to production. And what we're going to see is that very first step, it's going to calculate the deployment mode is now in a rollback. And we see that right here. And then what we're seeing is step 2, and then step 3 and step 6 are going to be skipped. Now, if you're curious about step 4 and step 5, those are only configured to run on our staging environment. So after we make the decision that we want to roll back, rolling back goes pretty quick, but we still have to make that decision. In this case, I was able to recover my application within 16 to 18 seconds. But making that decision can take time, and there's always that risk if am I going to be wrong? And that is definitely a concern. So let's take a look at some of the other cons with this rollback strategy. The big thing is that we cannot roll back if the database schema has any significant changes. So if I were to make any big schema changes, I added a new table, I added a new store procedure, I added a required column. Well, I probably can't roll back. I also have to take the time to make that determination. And any database schema change requires a roll forward at that point. This brings me on to the 3-minute rollback strategy. And we're getting closer and closer to immediate. And what this strategy means is we want to decouple the database changes from our application changes. So how this would look within Octopus Deploy is we would actually have two separate projects. We would have one for the database, and then we would have one for the project. And both, excuse me, one for the application. And both projects, they would store the deployment process for both for their particular components. I would even argue that you should also have your database schema stored in a completely separate Git repository with a separate build process. They should be truly decoupled from one another. But in order to do this, we have to change how we make our database changes, and we have to adapt a new pattern. And if you're not familiar with this pattern, this is known as the expand and contract pattern. And what we're going to be doing is imagine that we want to change a column name from color name to color code. And apparently we're living in Australia or Britain because we spelled color with a U. And in the old days, with everything coupled together, how it would work is I would change the column name using probably SB rename if I was on SQL Server. I would then update, like I said, the views, the store procedures, and the code, and everything would go out in one single deployment. And it works fine, but I have coupled my database and my code changes together. With this, we're going to end up having 4 unique deployments. So the first deployment is going to be on the database. And this is where we add color code to the database. And we add it as a nullable column. It's not required. We just add it to the database. And then after that has gone out, it's gone all the way up to production. Then we update the code to read and write to both columns. We also have a backfill process where we're backfilling color code from color name during this time. Then at some point, maybe after a few days, a week, whatever the case may be, we'll then make the determination, well, now we can remove color name. And so we remove the code that references or writes to color name throughout our entire code base. And we'd push that out to production as well. And then maybe another week goes by or another couple days go by. Then we have the final deployment that will remove color name from the database. So in place of one deployment, we end up having instead of one deployment, we end up having 4 deployments to do this. But it's a very disciplined approach on doing something like this. So how this would work is that all your database changes then are backwards compatible with at least two versions of your application, if not more. On top of that, you'll need to deploy your database changes hours or even days before your application's deployment. You shouldn't be deploying both of them within minutes of one another because really you've coupled the two of them together. Now, the advantage of deploying your database changes hours or days before the application deployment is you know that newer version of the schema is going to work with the current version of your application as well as the newer version of your application. And if an issue is found after you deploy your application, you can always redeploy the previous version of the application's code without having to worry about skipping steps. And you also know that the database, excuse me, your application is going to work with the database because it had previously been working with the database. So let's take a look at what this looks like within Octopus Deploy. So let's come back to our dashboard. And I have already deployed my database change. So if we look at Trident database, it has already gone up to production. It went up earlier this morning. Now, in terms of the process itself, the big difference here is that you'll notice I don't have a calculate deployment mode. I'm not only running steps uh, if we're doing a deployment or we're doing a rollback. And if we take a look at the run conditions, we're going to notice that all of them are set to success only. We don't have any sort of variable run condition. I won't go through all of the steps. I mean, you can just assume that it's going to work that way. But that's going to be kind of the big difference in terms of how it works within Octopus Deploy. Now, if we come back to the website, we'll see that we have a version ready to go, 4.4.15. So let's go ahead and deploy that out to production as well. And this particular process, it only has the steps to deploy our application, step 1, 2, and 3. And so this is going to go fairly quickly because we don't have to wait on the database. So once we're ready to deploy our code, it does go even faster, which is a big benefit. I mean, we're done within a few seconds. That's a pretty big win. And if we run into any sort of issues, let's say that we just deployed out to production and something's not working. Despite our smoke tests passing, we're finding some sort of key show-stopping bug once we put this on load. Well, rolling back is as simple as we just want to redeploy, just like before. But again, we don't have to worry about calculating the deployment mode, and we don't have to worry about skipping steps. We just have the exact same process work for everything. One other thing I want to point out within this 3-minute recovery model is you'll notice that the version numbers are a little different. My build numbers are slightly different. So I'm not tied to that anymore. So I can maybe only make one database change, but I might end up making several code changes throughout my normal software development lifecycle. So they can be linked somewhat, but they don't have to be linked exactly with the version numbers. Now, there are cons to this approach. And I won't lie, it's not all sunshines and rainbow or anything along those lines. This is a very disciplined approach that everyone has to buy in across the board. It's not something that's just can be enforced at the tool level. The developers have to buy in, the database developers, if you have them, the DBAs, your support people, your business owners, your business analysts, your QA, everyone that's involved with that application, they have to buy in because you're doing a lot more deployments in this particular sense versus doing one deployment at a time. You're also going to need to have a very robust automated testing suite because the only way to know for sure that the schema change is going to work with both versions of your application is to test. And there's no way you can manually test that. So you need to automatically test that. And that should be through every single time you push in a code change or whatever the case may be. And depending on your application, this can very much seem like overkill. So something to keep in mind with this is that is the 10-minute recovery process, does that get you 95% of the way there? Does it make sense to get to this next level? Some might argue yes, some might argue no. I personally like decoupling database changes from your code changes, but it is extra work. And you can certainly decouple your database changes um, with not even thinking about rollbacks, but this is just a good way to make your database changes more robust. Now let's move on to the immediate rollback strategy. And this is if we need to recover instantaneously. In order to do this successfully, you need to adopt a blue-green or a staging deployment pattern. Essentially, what it means is we need to run two versions of your application in production at the same time, and we're using a load balancer to control the traffic as to which application is active at any given point in time. We need to adopt the expand and contract pattern. That is an absolute criticality for this to work successfully because both versions of code. So in our case, say deployment after we do deployment 3, well, we're going to have one version of code that doesn't reference color name whatsoever, and we're going to have another version of code that does reference color name. And so we need to make sure that we can support both of those. So the only way to do that is to have the expand and contract pattern. The key here is we need to separate the concept of deployment or deploying the code to a particular location like staging or production from release. What I mean by that is from releasing that functionality to your user base. Now, I like diagrams, so bear with me as we go through a couple diagrams. So in this particular case, imagine that we have a user and they're accessing our application V1 through a load balancer or an ingress controller, depending on your technology. Octopus Deploy comes along, it updates the database, and then several hours later, it deploys application V2. Now, once application V2 is finished deploying, then we kick off a validation process. Meanwhile, while all this is happening, the user is still accessing application V1. Now, assuming the validation process is successful, then we will change the load balancer and ingress controller to go to application V2. If something bad happens, something wrong occurs during that validation process, we will stay on application V1. Or if we need to roll back, we would just go back to application V1. And it's just a configuration change at that point. We're not redeploying anything. It was funny when I was putting together this slide deck, I couldn't help but think of this meme, which is I don't always test my code, but when I do it in production because that's essentially what we're doing. We are testing code in production. Hopefully it isn't the first time you test your code, but you will be testing your code in production with this process. Now, if you want a more controlled way to release new features and functionality to your users, this is when feature flags would come in. And what feature flags enable us to do is we can release functionality to a subset of users initially. So maybe it might be internal users or some identifiable beta testers. And if any sort of issues occur, we don't enable that feature for other users. We fix the issue and then we push that out to all of our other users at that point in time. And this allows us to have more of a canary style deployment at that point in time. We're testing with subsets of users. The problem with using a canary for, say, an application using a load balancer to manage your canary deployments is that load balancers are typically not that smart and it doesn't understand some of the nuance between features and functionality. And you might end up in a situation where you've redirected the wrong traffic or you have to worry about something like that. By having feature flags, you get a bit more control. Just like before, how this would work is all database changes are backwards compatible. And the big difference here is we're testing changes in production prior to releasing them to users. If any sort of issue is found, we don't update that load balancer. And imagine that we did do a release and we release the functionality to the users. If something bad happens, we update the load balancer to point back to the previous version if that critical issue occurs. So let's take a look at what this looks like with Octopus Deploy because it's slightly different than the 3-minute recovery. Now, one big difference that I have here is that I haven't made any database changes since September 1st. And that's gone all, we have had everything go out to production. With the database process, it looks exactly the same as the other one. with a 3-minute recovery process. There's no difference here. Same exact steps, same exact uh, success variable run is no variable run conditions. You have the same run condition. Nothing is different. The big difference here is going to be within the web application itself. In this particular case, I have a version that's ready to go. And we can see that production blue was the last thing that was deployed to. So that's running 404.6. So in this particular case, I would click on deploy for production green. And I have one new step in this process. And this is the run update load balancer runbook. And so what I'm doing here is I'm running some smoke tests. I'd run my validation process automatically, and assuming that they all passed, which we see they did all successfully pass, then we would invoke a runbook to change the load balancer over. Now, there's some philosophical differences, and we can certainly discuss that as to should you update or call the load balancer runbook update as part of your deployment process. There's an argument to be made that you should. There's also an argument to be made that maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you should wait and have that invoked manually, or schedule that to run at say 7 p.m., but you push everything out at 1:32 p.m. as we're at my current time right now. So it's completely up to you as to when you would invoke that runbook. But let's say that there's an issue now. We are finding all kinds of problems after we switched everything from production blue to production green. There's some sort of critical issue that we need. Instead of redeploying like we have in the past, we would come into our runbooks and then we would update the load balancer and we would say we want to go back to production blue. So we'd select production blue and we click on run. And then in this particular case, we could then update the load balancer. So now we've gone back to production blue. So this is the immediacy of this. We were able to change the traffic over fairly quickly to the different, via the load balancer. We don't have to redeploy anything. Just like before, there are cons to this approach. It is a very disciplined approach, especially since we're going to be adopting the expand and contract pattern. You also need to run multiple copies of your application in production and multiple versions in production as well. And there's a risk as to how is that going to work. And so if you do something like this, you're going to have to probably work through a number of different issues initially because you never ran multiple versions of your application in production. And they are running. It's just a matter of who is accessing it because you might just have a version that's only accessible by your operations and your developers, whereas all your other users are using the other version. But it's something to consider. You also still need that very robust automated testing suite to verify everything is going to work, but it should also be able to run in production as well. If you want to use this, but you don't want to adopt feature flags, if you were to switch back from production blue to production green or from production green to production blue, if you have new features, you might confuse your users if you suddenly take them away. So something to consider. And depending on the application, it can also be seen as overkill. So again, it's up to you as to which strategy you want to adopt. But there are the three different strategies that are available to you. So now let's talk a little bit about automated rollbacks because this is one of the more probably contentious part of this webinar. So when I hear someone say, I want to automate my rollbacks, I want to automatically recover my code if something bad happens, what I start thinking about is that you really want to play with fire because there's a there's a great deal of risk with automating your rollbacks. And I'm going to get into that in just a second, but you are going to be playing with fire with this. And it's not a technical problem. If you're using a tool such as an APM, such as a New Relic or App Dynamics or something that's monitoring your application, and if it detects a number of errors occur after you do a deployment, you can 100% automate that rollback and leveraging the CLI or the API. Just call the script and then just roll back that version using Octopus Deploy. Very simple to do. And if you're doing blue-green deployments, you just need to implement a runbook. Just run a runbook. It's very simple to do. The pitfalls with automating your rollbacks is that unless you are doing 10 deployments to production a day, most production deployments, if you're deploying once a week, you're going to have a mix of bug fixes, security enhancements, new features, and you cannot pick a specific change to roll back unless you're using something like feature flags. But if you're not, if you just want to do something where I'm just going to redeploy my application, everything must roll back or none of it rolls back. There's not a, oh, I only want to roll back this one feature. I want to disable this one feature. Unless that's built in, you can't. So when you roll back that feature, you're also rolling back all your bug fixes and any security enhancements or anything else. And so that could be extremely risky because now you're reintroducing a bug back into the ecosystem. The other thing that's going to occur is defining when an automated rollback should occur. And I've typically seen two schools of thought with something like this. You might have a situation where you have a lot of false positives. So you've configured it to be a little bit loose. So you'd say, I want to roll back if I get more than 10 errors occurring within my application in the first 5 minutes. But it might be because you ran it, one user encountered the same error and they just refreshed the page 5 times. And so that triggers an automatic rollback. Now, should that happen? Should that happen? That's where the context comes into play. On the opposite side of that equation, you might set it up so only the sun, the moon, and the stars in a 2001 style, a Space Odyssey style, needs to occur in order for a rollback to occur. So you never have an automated rollback ever happen. And so what you end up doing is you end up spending a ton of time dialing in when that automated rollback should occur. And really, you're not really solving the core problem as to how does that bad code get to the users to trigger that rollback to begin with. You're really just hiding it at that point. So going back to classic 90s action films, instead of taking the database out of the equation, I propose we take the rollback out of the equation if you want to start talking about automating your rollbacks. And what I mean by that is implement a blue green or stage deployment pattern where you're running two versions of your application in production at once and thoroughly test the new version prior to changing the load balancer to allow your users to access the code. Have this validation process be extremely robust. And if there's any sort of problems, if any of those tests fail, just don't change the load balancer. Don't let the users get access to that code. Prevent that from happening to begin with. On top of that, if you want to take it a step further, leverage feature flags as well, where you can control how fast a feature is added to your user base. And if a problem is found, you stop rolling it out. Don't release the you don't release the feature to all the users once you start finding those issues. Essentially, what we want to do is we want to put several gates in place to prevent that bad code from even getting to the users. So we don't ever have to roll back anything. We only need to just prevent that from ever happening to begin with. And so here's the funny thing about this is that if you adopt this pattern, if you adopt the blue green deployment pattern, the stage deployment pattern, you have that immediate rollback scenario. But have actually created the ideal roll forward scenario. Because if you think about it, users never or very rarely would ever get access to that bad code. And this would allow you to fix those problems and where it's a much more sane way during the work hours, the next day, and then push it out during the next prod deployment window. Maybe it's later the next day, maybe it's the next week, whatever the case may be. But users never even get access to that code. And this means every production change follows the same process, regardless if it's a bug fix, security enhancement, some sort of new feature. It's all flowing forward at that point in time. And so then you're minimizing any sort of downstream impacts that could occur to any other application if you suddenly do a rollback. Because it's important to note that for a lot of applications, when you roll back, that doesn't occur in isolation unless you're on the very, very tail end or you've completely decoupled everything from everyone and you've fully embraced microservices. And so this is, I would say, the twist to this webinar is that by going all in on rollbacks, you actually make the best rollback strategy. You actually make the best rolling forward strategy possible. And this is why my default recommendation for a lot of these use cases is always to roll forward. And if you adopt blue-green strategy, you then get the best way to roll forward. With that being said, let's kind of summarize everything that we learned for today. Octopus Deploy supports a variety of rollback strategies. It's really up to your application as to what's the best strategy for you. That being said, always roll forward your database changes. You're going to find your life is immediately better when you start doing that, and you don't have to worry about losing data or anything like that. And there are 3 rollback strategies. There's the 10-minute rollback, where we just are skipping the database steps when rolling back, but we have to make the decision on whether or not to roll back. The 3-minute rollback, where we don't have that decision anymore. That's because we've decoupled the database changes from our application changes. And then finally, we have the immediate rollback strategy, which is the blue-green or staging deployment pattern, where we are running 2 versions of our application in production at the same time. And if we do the immediate rollback strategy, we create the ideal rollback strategy. And then never forget, if we want to do this successfully, we want to test our code in production. But we want to do that for validation purposes, not the first time that we've ever tested the code. So I want to be respectful of your time. If you have any questions, I know I kind of took a bit of a controversial opinion towards the end. If you want to chat with me some more, I would love to hear from you. Please feel free to reach out to me. And just as a reminder, an email of the recording will be link to the recording will be emailed to you within 24 hours. I see that we've had a couple questions come through.
Yeah, we've included some links in the chat there.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Bob. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
One thing you can't roll back is your enthusiasm for this sort of thing. So that's great. And another thing you can't roll back is the obvious sort of webinars that we're doing over the next few weeks. So if you go to octopus.com/webinars, you'll find a whole host of webinars that are coming up there. And if you have any questions, feel free to hit up with Bob on emails there. So, Bob, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time.